The handcuffs clicked shut around my wrists as I watched my neighbor's teenage daughter splash in my own pool, laughing with her friends like nothing had happened. Sheriff Karen stood behind me, her badge gleaming in the afternoon sun, whispering in my ear with that cold smile I had come to know so well. "You should have minded your own business," she said, her voice barely audible over the sound of teenagers destroying my property. "Now you are going to learn what happens when you mess with my family." As they loaded me into the back of her patrol car, I caught sight of Madison floating on my pool raft, raising a beer bottle in mock salute. That was the moment I realized the truth that would change everything. Sheriff Karen had no idea who she was really dealing with. For 15 years, I had worked double shifts at the plant to afford my dream home. Every dollar I saved went toward building the perfect backyard sanctuary. The pool was my crown jewel, a sparkling oasis surrounded by carefully planted roses, and a deck I had built with my own hands during countless weekends. That Tuesday evening in June changed everything. I pulled into my driveway after a long day, already imagining the quiet evening I had planned by the water. Instead, I heard voices and splashing coming from my backyard. My heart raced as I walked around the side of my house, certain I would find a broken pipe or some other emergency. What I found was far worse. 5 teenagers were in my pool, diving off my diving board, drinking from red Solo cups while music blasted from a portable speaker on my patio table. Pool floats I had never seen before drifted across the water, and empty chip bags littered my deck. I stood there for a full minute, trying to process what I was seeing. These were not neighbor kids who had wandered over by mistake. These were strangers who had made themselves completely at home in my private space. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice shaking slightly. "This is my pool, you cannot be here." A blonde girl in a bright pink bikini turned toward me with the kind of dismissive look I had only seen in movies. She was maybe 17, with perfectly straightened hair, and an expression that suggested I was the one who did not belong. "Relax, lady," she said, not even bothering to get out of the water. "We are not hurting anything. We will be gone in a few hours." "You do not understand," I said, walking closer to the pool edge. "This is private property. You are trespassing. I need you to leave right now." The girl laughed and turned to her friends. "Did you guys hear that? She wants us to leave her pool." The others joined in the laughter, as if my request was the most ridiculous thing they had ever heard. "Look, I am not trying to be mean," I continued, feeling my face flush with embarrassment and anger. "But this is my home. You cannot just use someone else's pool without permission." The blonde girl finally swam to the edge and pulled herself out of the water, dripping chlorine onto my carefully sealed deck boards. Up close, I could see she was older than I had first thought, maybe 18 or 19, with the kind of confidence that only comes from never being told no. "I am Madison," she said, as if her name should mean something to me. "And you are being really uptight about this. It is just a pool. We are not stealing anything." I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "Madison, I am sure you are a nice person, but I work very hard to maintain this property. I cannot have strangers using my pool without permission. I am asking you politely to gather your things and leave." Madison rolled her eyes and picked up a towel from one of my patio chairs. "Fine, whatever. We were getting bored anyway." She turned to her friends still in the water. "Come on, guys. The fun police showed up." As they slowly gathered their belongings, I noticed they left behind empty bottles, wet towels on my furniture, and muddy footprints across my deck. Madison walked past me toward the gate, pausing just long enough to look me up and down with barely concealed contempt. "You know," she said, "you should really learn to share. It is not like you were even using it." That night, I sat on my patio cleaning up the mess they had left behind, wondering how strangers had gotten into my fenced backyard in the first place. I checked the gate and found it was still locked, which meant they had climbed over. The thought of teenagers scaling my fence to use my pool without permission sent a chill down my spine. I had no idea that this was just the beginning. The next evening, I was watering my garden when I heard car doors slamming in my driveway. I walked around front to find a sheriff's patrol car parked behind a small red convertible, and my heart sank as I recognized Madison climbing out of the passenger seat. The driver's door of the patrol car opened, and out stepped a woman in full sheriff's uniform. She was probably in her late 40s, with short brown hair and the kind of authoritative posture that comes with years of wearing a badge. She adjusted her utility belt as she walked toward me, her hand resting casually on her radio. "Are you the homeowner?" she asked, her tone professional but cold. "Yes, I am," I replied, confused about why a sheriff's deputy was at my house. "Is there a problem?" "I am Sheriff Karen Mills," she said, pulling out a small notepad. "I understand you had some kind of altercation with my daughter yesterday." The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. Madison was the sheriff's daughter, which explained her entitled attitude and complete lack of concern about trespassing on private property. "There was no altercation," I said carefully. "I simply asked your daughter and her friends to leave my pool area. They were on my property without permission." Sheriff Karen glanced over at Madison, who was leaning against the convertible with her arms crossed, wearing the same dismissive expression from the day before. "According to Madison, you were pretty hostile about the whole thing," Karen said, looking back at her notepad. "She said you threatened to call the police." I felt my face getting hot. I did not threaten anyone. I politely asked them to leave my private property. That is my right as a homeowner. "Well, here is the thing," Karen said, stepping closer to me. "Madison has been swimming in this neighborhood for years. A lot of the neighbors let the kids use their pools during the summer. It builds community spirit." "That may be true for other neighbors," I replied, "but no one asked my permission. I came home from work to find strangers in my backyard." Karen smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Look, I get it. You are new to the neighborhood, still learning how things work around here. But Madison is a good kid. She is not some criminal you need to worry about." "I never said she was a criminal," I said, feeling increasingly frustrated. "But I do have the right to decide who uses my pool." "Of course you do," Karen said, but her tone suggested otherwise. "I am just saying, in a small town like this, we all have to get along. We all have to be good neighbors." Madison pushed herself off the car and walked over to stand next to her mother. "I told you she was weird about it, Mom. She acted like we were robbing her or something." "I was not weird about anything," I said, my voice rising slightly. "I was protecting my property." Karen held up her hand. "Now, let us all just calm down here. I am sure we can work this out like reasonable adults." She looked directly at me, and I could see the calculation in her eyes. "The thing is, if Madison and her friends cannot swim here anymore, they are going to need somewhere else to go. And teenage kids with nowhere to go tend to get into trouble." The implication was clear, and it made my stomach turn. She was essentially threatening me with the possibility of her daughter causing problems if I did not let her use my pool. "Are you saying I have to let your daughter swim in my pool or there will be consequences?" I asked. Karen laughed, but it sounded forced. "Of course not. I am just pointing out that good neighbors try to work together. especially when one of those neighbors is in law enforcement and understands how important community relationships are. She handed me a business card with her official contact information. If you have any problems in the future, any problems at all, you give me a call. I want to make sure you feel safe and welcome in this neighborhood. The way she emphasized the word problems made it clear this was not an offer of help. It was a warning. After they left, I stood in my driveway holding her business card, trying to process what had just happened. A sheriff had come to my home, not to investigate a trespassing complaint, but to intimidate me into allowing her daughter to continue trespassing. I walked back to my pool area and noticed fresh footprints on my deck. While I had been talking to Corinne in the front yard, Madison had apparently gone around back to scope out my property again. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside made me wonder if teenagers were climbing over my fence again. But worse than the fear was the realization that the person who was supposed to protect citizens from crime was instead using her badge to enable it. I had always believed that calling the police was the solution to problems like this. Now, I understood that sometimes the police are the problem. Over the next 2 weeks, the pool parties became a regular occurrence. Madison and her friends showed up every few days, always when I was not home, always leaving behind evidence of their unauthorized gatherings. I would return from work to find wet towels draped over my patio furniture, empty bottles floating in the pool, and cigarette butts scattered across my deck. The damage was getting worse each time. My pool skimmer was cracked, apparently from someone jumping on it. One of my underwater lights had been shattered, leaving dangerous glass fragments on the pool bottom that I had to vacuum out myself. The lock on my storage shed had been broken, and several of my pool chemicals were missing. I installed a security camera aimed at my backyard, hopping to document what was happening when I was not home. The footage was even more disturbing than I had imagined. Madison was not just bringing 4 or 5 friends anymore. The most recent party had included nearly 20 teenagers, some of whom I recognized as being well into their 20s. They were not just swimming. They were diving off my roof, using my patio furniture as diving platforms, and playing music so loud that my neighbors 3 houses away would have been able to hear it. In one particularly shocking clip, I watched a young man throw one of my potted plants into the deep end of the pool, laughing as the ceramic pot shattered against the concrete. But the most disturbing part was Madison herself. In the videos, she moved around my property like she owned it, directing her friends to different areas of my yard, opening my storage shed to get pool equipment, and even using my outdoor shower to rinse off. She had completely taken over my private space and turned it into her personal entertainment venue. I tried calling the non-emergency police line to file a formal complaint. The dispatcher took my information and said an officer would be sent out to take a report. 3 hours later, a young deputy arrived at my door. He looked nervous as he explained that he was there about a trespassing complaint. "I have video evidence," I told him, leading him to my computer where I had saved the security footage. "This has been going on for weeks." The deputy watched a few minutes of the footage, taking notes in a small pad. "This is definitely trespassing," he said. "Have you tried talking to the homeowner about securing your property better?" I stared at him in disbelief. "I am the homeowner. These people are trespassing on my property. I want to press charges." The deputy shifted uncomfortably. "Right, of course. The thing is, some of these kids look pretty young. Are you sure you want to press charges against minors? It could get complicated." "The ringleader is not a minor," I said, pointing to Madison on the screen. "She is 18 years old and she is the sheriff's daughter." The deputy's expression changed immediately. He stopped taking notes and closed his pad. "The sheriff's daughter, are you sure about that?" "Completely sure. Sheriff Mills came to my house 2 weeks ago to discuss this situation. She knows what her daughter is doing." The deputy was quiet for a long moment, staring at the frozen image on my computer screen. "Look," he said finally, "I am going to file this report, but I have to be honest with you. Cases involving law enforcement families can be complicated. You might want to consider handling this privately." "How exactly am I supposed to handle it privately?" I asked. "I have already asked them to stop. I have installed security cameras. I have spoken to the sheriff herself. What else can I do?" The deputy packed up his notepad without answering my question. "I will file the report," he repeated. "Someone from the department will be in touch." Nobody from the department ever got in touch. 2 days later, I came home to find the largest party yet in progress. There were cars parked on my lawn, music loud enough to rattle my windows, and at least 30 people in and around my pool. Someone had set up a beer pong table on my deck using my patio furniture, and teenagers were taking turns jumping from my second-story bedroom window directly into the deep end. This time I called 911. "I need police immediately," I told the dispatcher. "There are 30 people trespassing on my property and they are destroying it." "Is anyone in immediate danger?" the dispatcher asked. "Yes," I said, watching someone throw a glass bottle that shattered against my pool house. "People are getting hurt, and my property is being destroyed." "Units are on the way," she said. I waited in my car at the end of my driveway, afraid to confront such a large crowd by myself. 20 minutes later, a single patrol car arrived. The officer who got out was the same young deputy who had taken my report days earlier. He walked up to my car window with a grim expression. "Ma'am, I responded to your call, but when I got here, there was nobody on your property. Are you sure you saw trespassers?" I looked past him toward my backyard where I could still hear music and voices. "They are still there," I said. "You can hear them from here." The deputy looked back toward my house and shrugged. "I do not hear anything. Maybe they left when they saw my patrol car." It was a lie, and we both knew it. The party was still in full swing, but he was pretending not to notice. That night, after the crowd finally dispersed around midnight, I surveyed the damage to my property. It looked like a war zone. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse with a folder full of printed photographs showing the damage to my property. The destruction was extensive enough to file insurance claims, but I wanted to pursue criminal charges first. Someone needed to be held accountable for what had happened. The clerk at the district attorney's office was polite but discouraging. "Trespassing cases involving juveniles usually get handled through mediation," she explained. "Have you considered reaching out to the parents directly?" "I did reach out to the parent," I said. "The parent is Sheriff Mills, and she basically told me to allow it to continue." The clerk's expression changed, and she excused herself to speak with someone in the back office. When she returned, she was accompanied by an older man in a suit who introduced himself as Assistant District Attorney Morrison. "I understand you are having some issues with neighborhood kids," he said, settling into the chair across from me. I explained the entire situation, showing him the photographs and security footage I had compiled. He listened politely, occasionally asking questions about dates and times, but I could tell his attention was elsewhere. "This is certainly a frustrating situation," he said when I finished. "But prosecuting the sheriff's daughter for trespassing would be politically complicated. Are you sure mediation would not be a better option?" Mediation assumes both parties want to resolve the conflict, I replied. Sheriff Mills has made it clear that she supports her daughter's behavior. There is nothing to mediate. Morrison leaned back in his chair. Look, I am going to be straight with you. Sheriff Mills is an elected official with a lot of community support. Taking her daughter to court would be a big deal around here. It would make headlines. Are you prepared for that kind of attention? The implication was clear. He was warning me that pursuing justice would come with personal consequences. What you are telling me, I said, is that the sheriff's daughter is above the law. I am not saying that at all, Morrison replied quickly. I am just pointing out that there are practical considerations. Have you thought about installing a better fence? Maybe some security lighting? I left the courthouse feeling more frustrated than ever. Every official I spoke to treated this like a minor neighborhood dispute that I should solve by making my property more secure. Nobody seemed to understand that the real problem was not teenagers trespassing. The real problem was a corrupt sheriff using her badge to protect criminal behavior. That afternoon, I called a private attorney who specialized in civil rights cases. His consultation fee was $300 just to discuss the situation, and after hearing my story, his advice was depressing. You are absolutely right that your civil rights are being violated, he said. But suing a sheriff's department is expensive and time-consuming. We would be looking at years of litigation and tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees. And even if we win, collecting damages from a small-town sheriff's department can be difficult. He leaned forward across his desk. My honest advice: document everything, install better security, and hope they get bored and move on. Fighting the system is noble, but it is also expensive. I walked out of his office feeling completely defeated. Every avenue I had tried led to the same conclusion. Sheriff Mills was untouchable, and her daughter could do whatever she wanted. That evening, I sat on my damaged patio, looking at my pool with its broken lights and cracked equipment. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I seriously considered selling my house and moving somewhere else. But then I remembered something my father had told me years ago. Sometimes, he had said, when you cannot go through a problem, you have to go around it. Maybe it was time to stop trying to work within a system that was designed to protect Sheriff Mills. Maybe it was time to get creative. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. If the official channels would not help me, I would build a case so comprehensive and damaging that even Sheriff Mills could not ignore it. But first, I needed to understand exactly who I was dealing with. I started with public records. Sheriff Karen Mills had been elected 3 times, always running unopposed after her first campaign. Her salary was a matter of public record, but when I compared it to her lifestyle, the numbers did not add up. She lived in a house worth twice what her government salary could support, and her daughter drove a car that cost more than most people made in a year. The more I dug, the more questions I had. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests for her department's budget records, overtime reports, and equipment purchases. What I found was disturbing. Over the past 5 years, the sheriff's department had requested emergency funding for equipment that was never properly documented. Thousands of dollars in taxpayer money had been spent on items that seemed to have disappeared. But the real breakthrough came when I started researching other complaints against Sheriff Mills. I discovered that I was not the first person to have problems with her abuse of power. There was a pattern of behavior going back years. A local businessman had tried to file a complaint after Mills had her deputies harass his customers over bogus parking violations. The harassment stopped only after he agreed to donate to her re-election campaign. A single mother had called 911 for help during a domestic violence incident, but Mills had arrived and somehow convinced her not to press charges against her abusive boyfriend, who happened to be the nephew of a county commissioner. The most disturbing case involved an elderly man who had tried to report that Mills was using county vehicles for personal errands. Within a week of filing his complaint, he was arrested on suspicious drug charges that were later dropped for lack of evidence. The message was clear: cross Sheriff Mills and you would pay for it. I reached out to these people carefully, not identifying myself at first, just asking general questions about their experiences with local law enforcement. Once I explained my situation, they were surprisingly willing to talk. Everyone had a story about Sheriff Mills abusing her power, but nobody had been willing to speak up because they were afraid of retaliation. "She is like a mob boss with a badge," one of them told me during a quiet conversation at a coffee shop 3 towns over. "She has turned that sheriff's department into her personal protection racket." The elderly man who had been arrested on false drug charges was the most helpful. "I still have copies of everything," he told me. "Photos, documents, recordings. I kept it all because I knew someday she would go too far with the wrong person." He was right. Sheriff Mills had finally gone too far, and I was the wrong person to mess with. What none of them knew, what Sheriff Mills had never bothered to find out, was my professional background. Before moving to this small town, I had worked for 15 years as a forensic accountant for a federal agency. I specialized in following money trails and building cases against people who thought they were too smart to get caught. Sheriff Mills had picked the wrong person to intimidate. I spent the next 3 weeks building a comprehensive file on her activities: financial irregularities, abuse of power, violation of civil rights, misuse of public resources. Every piece of evidence was carefully documented, cross-referenced, and verified through multiple sources. The pool parties continued during this time, but now I saw them differently. Each party was not just an attack on my property. It was Sheriff Mills showing off her power, demonstrating that she could protect her daughter no matter what crimes she committed. It was her way of marking her territory and warning other citizens not to challenge her authority. But what she did not realize was that every party gave me more evidence. Every act of trespassing and vandalism was carefully documented. Every failure by her department to respond to my complaints was recorded. Every lie told by her deputies was preserved on video. I was building the case that would bring down her entire corrupt operation. The final piece of the puzzle came when I discovered that Sheriff Mills had been using her position to protect local drug dealers in exchange for campaign contributions and personal payments. The evidence was complex and required careful analysis, but it was solid. Sheriff Mills was not just abusing her power to protect her daughter's pool parties. She was running a criminal enterprise. In early August, Madison announced on social media that she was planning the biggest pool party of the summer to celebrate her 19th birthday. The event was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, and from her posts, it was clear she expected over 50 people to attend. This was the opportunity I had been waiting for. Instead of trying to prevent the party, I decided to let it happen while documenting every moment. I installed additional security cameras around my property, including several hidden units that would capture angles the obvious cameras might miss. I set up audio recording equipment to document noise violations and any illegal activity. Most importantly, I sent detailed notifications to every relevant authority, creating an official record that they had been warned about the planned criminal activity and chose to do nothing about it. The party began at noon on Saturday, and within an hour my backyard looked like a music festival. Cars were parked on my lawn, strangers were using my outdoor shower, and someone had set up a DJ booth on my deck using electricity they had somehow tapped from my house. I watched from inside my home as Madison held court by my pool, clearly enjoying her role as the center of attention. She was wearing a tiara and a sash that said "Birthday Princess," and her friends were treating her like royalty. But this was not just a teenage birthday party. As the afternoon progressed, the crowd grew older and more intoxicated. I recognized several people who were clearly in their 20s and 30s, including some who looked like they might be friends of Sheriff Mills rather than Madison's peers. By 4 o'clock, there were open containers of alcohol everywhere, despite the fact that many of the party guests were clearly underage. Someone had brought marijuana, and the smell was strong enough that my neighbors 2 houses away would be able to detect it. A group of older men had started a poker game using my patio table, with what looked like serious money-changing hands. At 5:30, a patrol car pulled up to my house. I watched through my window as Sheriff Mills herself got out, but instead of breaking up the party, she walked around to my backyard and joined the celebration. This was the moment I had been hopping for. My hidden cameras captured Sheriff Mills laughing with the poker players, accepting a beer from one of the underage party guests, and even taking photos with Madison and her friends. She was not there as a law enforcement officer responding to a complaint. She was there as a party guest, actively participating in multiple criminal activities. The party reached its peak around 7 o'clock, when someone suggested they needed more space for dancing. I watched in horror as a group of teenagers began throwing my patio furniture into the pool to clear the deck. Chairs, tables, and planters crashed into the water while the crowd cheered. Sheriff Mills was standing less than 10 feet away when it happened. She saw my furniture being destroyed, and she did nothing to stop it. In fact, my cameras captured her laughing and taking video with her phone as if it was the funniest thing she had ever seen. The party finally began to wind down around 10 o'clock, but the damage was extensive. My pool was filled with broken furniture, empty bottles, and debris. My deck was stained with spilled drinks and littered with cigarette butts and food waste. Someone had spray-painted graffiti on the side of my pool house. But the property damage was not the most important thing I had captured that day. What I had documented was a clear pattern of criminal activity, with Sheriff Mills not just failing to prevent it, but actively participating in it. Underage drinking, drug use, destruction of private property, trespassing, and gambling, all happening under the direct supervision of the county's top law enforcement officer. As I reviewed the footage that night, I realized I had captured something even more valuable than evidence of criminal activity. I had captured Sheriff Mills being herself, dropping the professional mask she wore in public and revealing the corrupt, entitled person she really was. In one particularly damaging clip, I had audio of her laughing about how that uptight neighbor would probably have a heart attack when she saw the mess. She was talking about me, joking about the destruction of my property while standing in my backyard. The next morning, I compiled everything into a comprehensive evidence package. Video footage, audio recordings, photographs, financial documents, and witness statements. It was the kind of case that federal prosecutors dream about: rock-solid evidence of systematic corruption by an elected official. But before I contacted the authorities, I made sure to create multiple copies of everything and store them in several secure locations. I had learned not to trust anyone in the local system, and I wanted to make sure my evidence could not disappear. Sheriff Mills had given me exactly what I needed to destroy her career and send her to prison. On Monday morning, I walked into the federal building in the state capitol, carrying a briefcase containing the most comprehensive corruption case they had seen in years. I had requested a meeting with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, and after reviewing a sample of my evidence, they had agreed to see me immediately. Special Agent Rodriguez listened quietly as I presented my case, occasionally asking questions about specific pieces of evidence. Her partner, Agent Chen, took detailed notes and requested copies of key documents. When I finished my presentation, the room was silent for a long moment. "This is impressive work," Rodriguez finally said. "You have documented a clear pattern of corruption, abuse of office, and civil rights violations. How long did it take you to compile all of this?" 3 months, I replied. "But the criminal activity has been going on for years. I am just the first person who had the resources and expertise to properly document it." Agent Chen leaned forward. "Before we proceed, I need to ask, are you prepared for what comes next? Taking down a sheriff is a big deal in a small town. There will be media attention, legal proceedings, and probably some personal backlash." I thought about all the people Sheriff Mills had intimidated over the years, all the victims who had been too afraid to speak up. "I am prepared," I said. The federal investigation moved quickly once it began. Within a week, agents were interviewing witnesses, reviewing financial records, and gathering additional evidence. The case was even stronger than I had realized, because other victims came forward once word spread that someone was finally taking action against Sheriff Mills. The first sign that the walls were closing in came when Sheriff Mills called me directly. I was at work when my phone rang, and her name appeared on the caller ID. My hands were shaking as I answered. "I think we need to talk," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I do not think we have anything to discuss," I replied. "Listen carefully," she said. "I know what you have been doing, and I am warning you to stop. You are in over your head, and you are going to get hurt." "Are you threatening me, Sheriff Mills?" There was a pause. "I am giving you friendly advice. Drop this nonsense before it goes too far." "It has already gone too far," I said. "You should have thought about consequences before you decided to abuse your office." She hung up without another word. 2 days later, federal agents executed search warrants at the sheriff's department and Mills' personal residence. I watched the news coverage from my office, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and relief as I saw boxes of evidence being loaded into FBI vehicles. The local news interviewed several county commissioners, all of whom expressed shock at the allegations against Sheriff Mills. But I had done my research on them too, and I knew that at least 2 of them had received questionable donations from Mills over the years. The story made regional news when Sheriff Mills was arrested at her home on federal corruption charges. The perp walk was everything I had hoped for: Mills in handcuffs, looking haggard and defeated, while cameras captured her fall from power. Madison was arrested the same day on multiple charges related to the pool parties, including trespassing, vandalism, and providing alcohol to minors. Unlike her mother, she broke down completely when the handcuffs went on, crying and begging the agents to call her lawyer. The trials were a media sensation that lasted for months. Evidence I had gathered was presented piece by piece, painting a picture of systematic corruption that shocked even longtime residents who thought they knew their sheriff. Sheriff Mills tried to plea bargain, but federal prosecutors had such a strong case that they were not interested in deals. The evidence was overwhelming: financial records, video footage, audio recordings, and testimony from dozens of witnesses. The most dramatic moment came when they played the video of Mills laughing while my furniture was destroyed. The courtroom was silent as everyone watched their elected sheriff participate in criminal activity, while citizens begged for help. Mills was convicted on 17 federal charges, including corruption, civil rights violations, and conspiracy. She was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to all of her victims. Madison received probation and community service, but her reputation in the community was destroyed. The entitled teenager who had once treated my property like her personal playground now had to live with the consequences of her actions. But the most satisfying moment came when the judge read a statement during sentencing. Public officials who abuse their power, he said, attack the very foundation of our democratic system. Sheriff Mills used her badge to protect criminals and intimidate citizens. Her actions were a betrayal of everything law enforcement is supposed to represent. As I sat in the courtroom listening to those words, I thought about all the people who had told me to just install a better fence and hope the problem would go away. Sometimes justice takes time, but it is always worth the wait. 6 months after Sheriff Mills was sentenced, I finally felt safe enough to host my first pool party. But this was not a celebration of revenge. It was a community gathering for all the people who had been victimized by her corruption over the years. The elderly man who had been falsely arrested brought homemade barbecue. The businessman who had been harassed for refusing to pay bribes brought his whole family. The single mother who had been denied police protection brought a casserole and stories about how her life had improved since Mills was removed from office. We sat around my restored pool as the sun set, sharing stories and healing from years of abuse by a corrupt system. My property had been fully repaired, with new lights, new furniture, and a security system that I no longer needed but kept for peace of mind. You know what the best part is? The elderly man said as we watched kids playing safely in the water. We do not have to be afraid anymore. We can call the police without wondering if they are going to help us or hurt us. The new sheriff was a career law enforcement officer who had been brought in from outside the county, specifically to clean up the department. She had fired 4 deputies who had been complicit in Mills' corruption and implemented new oversight procedures to prevent future abuse. Crime rates in the county had actually decreased since Mills was removed, which surprised some people, but made perfect sense to those of us who understood that she had been protecting criminals rather than fighting them. Madison had moved away shortly after her probation ended, reportedly to live with relatives in another state. The house where she had grown up was sold to pay for her mother's legal fees and restitution payments. As I looked around at the faces of my neighbors that evening, I reflected on the lessons I had learned during this ordeal. The most important lesson was that standing up to corruption is not easy, but it is necessary. If good people do nothing when they witness abuse of power, the abuse will continue and get worse. I also learned that the system can work, but only when citizens are willing to do the hard work of holding officials accountable. The checks and balances that are supposed to prevent corruption only function when people use them. But perhaps the most important lesson was about the power of documentation and evidence. Sheriff Mills was able to intimidate and silence her victims for years because their complaints were based on word-of-mouth accounts that could be dismissed or ignored. But comprehensive evidence, video footage, financial records, and witness testimony could not be ignored or explained away. As the evening wound down, I walked around my property one last time, looking at the pool that had started this whole nightmare. The water was crystal clear, reflecting the stars above, and for the first time in months I felt truly at peace. The fight had been long and difficult, but it had been worth it. Not just for me, but for everyone who had suffered under Sheriff Mills' corrupt regime. Sometimes one person's refusal to back down can change an entire community. I thought about all the times people had told me to just accept the situation, to install better fences, to avoid making waves. But some fights are worth having, especially when the alternative is allowing corruption to flourish unchecked. My pool had become a symbol of something larger than property rights. It represented the principle that every citizen deserves equal treatment under the law, regardless of their connections or social status. It represented the idea that abuse of power should have consequences, no matter who is doing the abusing. As I turned off the pool lights and headed inside, I felt grateful for the opportunity to stand up for what was right. The experience had been traumatic and expensive, but it had also been empowering. I had learned that ordinary citizens have more power than they realize if they are willing to use it. Sheriff Mills was serving her sentence in federal prison, her career and reputation destroyed by her own actions. Madison was starting over in a new state, hopefully having learned that privilege comes with responsibility. And I was back to enjoying my peaceful backyard sanctuary, knowing that justice had been served. The pool parties were over, but the lesson would last forever. When good people stand up to corruption, democracy wins. Sometimes that is all the victory you need.